So as a researcher and a practitioner in refugee mental health issues, I'll comment on some of my current perspectives on psychosocial adaptation and social inclusion of refugees currently. And I'll begin by just speaking because of the current incoming families, Syrian families. I'll speak specifically to some of the current kind of considerations for the resettlement and social inclusion of Syrian families. So overall, in my opinion, the general reaction at the local community level, especially with regards to private sponsorship, has been is impressive and encouraging. And also the government follow-up on their commitment to resettle 25,000 refugees is also really encouraging. Also, as we speak right now in December, many local agencies and government institutions such as Edmond Public Schools and Alberta Health Services are preparing and mobilizing around their own preparation for finding ways of welcoming and providing services to the incoming Syrian families. But I also want to point out that we need to keep in mind some of the broader refugee issues in the context of recent attention to resettlement of the Syrian families. This is an opportunity for us to really look at some of the ongoing concerns that we have had for a long time with regards to mental health service provision and social inclusion in the context of growing poverty rates, particularly amongst newcomer families in Alberta as well as other parts of the country, particularly in the aftermath of the 2008 economic cutbacks. So this has been something that those of us who work in this area have been quite concerned about. And so the current attention to mental health and the psychosocial needs often focuses on the impact of trauma and particularly PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as an outcome for many families and individuals. And this indeed is a major concern. Many of the conflicts in the world involve exposure to mass forms of violence, including things like sexual violence. And we know that that has a huge impact on individuals' ability to move forward in their lives. But we also know that many individuals who are exposed to trauma are able to actually recover quite well. And this depends very much on the type of supports that are provided to them in the aftermath of traumatic experiences. And for the most part, most people actually recover quite well and go on to live fulfilling lives. And so in my experience in community-based practice and in research, we also would like to kind of expand some of our current perceptions and attention to the issue of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. While safety, post-traumatic stress disorder is a violation and a threat to one's safety, psychological as well as physical safety system, and that is paramount in terms of ensuring that individuals who do come back, who do settle in, who resettle with, of most concern is ensuring that their safety and stabilization occurs almost immediately and in the months of their arrival in the country. But we also need to keep in mind that it's more than just about safety for many families. And so what I do in my work is I draw on some of the work of a psychiatrist and transcultural psychiatrist from Australia, Professor Derek Silove, who proposes a model of looking at psychosocial adaptation in the aftermath of trauma. And it expands our view to go beyond thinking about safety, to recognize that while safety and security is critical for individuals as well as groups, and ensuring their safety in the aftermath of trauma is critical for preventing the development of disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, we recognize that there are at least 4 other key psychosocial systems that are critical for people's overall growth and development. And one of these is attachment. We know that many individuals who've experienced trauma experience ruptured bonds and multiple losses as well as separations. So any effort to ensure that the social networks, family reunification, etc., are also attended to during resettlement and social inclusion are going to be really important for many of the families that are settling here in Edmonton and Alberta, as well as other refugee families that we are resettling in Canada. Another key psychosocial system is justice. Individuals who've experienced mass violence have also experienced human rights violation and abuses. And so we also need to keep in mind how we can work with communities to help them address these issues at that level as well. And also to recognize that there could be impacts for those over time if these key issues haven't been addressed for them in their lives. Role and identity is another key psychosocial pillar for individuals and communities. And so coming from contexts where they have experienced disrupted institutions and structures, it's going to be important for them to regain a sense of their own identity and roles in society by ensuring training, work skills development for individuals, but also providing supports that allow people to regain gainful employment and to be able to regain their sense of their own identity and dignity as contributors to society. And finally, one area that we often don't pay attention to in research, but is also critical, is the pillar system around existential meaning systems. Individuals and communities who've experienced undermining of their values, their cultures and belief systems, part of their own resettlement and social inclusion process is going to be important for them to have space to allow for them to actually redevelop their own meaning systems that are important to them. And so these are key elements that I wanted to point out, that moving beyond just thinking about safety, we do also need to think about attachments, human rights, justice, role and identities for individuals, as well as their own meaning systems, and providing supports not just in settlement, but overall thinking about this in terms of social inclusion should also consider these key psychosocial pillars that are critical for adaptation, particularly after trauma, but also as one integrates into our society.
Dr. Yohani's practice and also her research are also punctuated in the work that both of us do on African women immigrants, kind of a broad group that include refugees as well. If we start from the perspective of what is happening right now in Canada, as she has pointed out, the Canadian response to the global refugee crisis is commendable, but we must go beyond looking at what happened in the aftermath, that is looking at the situation at the aftermath. We must actually look at their resettlement from a much broader and holistic viewpoint. This is what the pieces we're beginning to pick up in other African and other communities who are still settling down after many years and sometimes decades of being in Canada. That many of these factors she pointed out have not been addressed. We started with the process of looking at migrants as people who require basic needs like housing, training, employment, etc. We moved into a stage and an era where we began to recognize that identity means a lot to them. In more recent times, we have actually come to a terrain where it has become very clear that we are not talking simply about settlement, we are not talking about integration, we are talking about matters of human security. Human security is not about the borders of states, it is really the ability for individuals to feel and know that they can think and act on themselves or of their own. What is becoming very clear is that many of these immigrant groups, including Africans, do not feel that way. For the refugees that we work with, some of whom are women who passed through women who had experiences of sexual violence in African conflict zones, it is very clear that they do not want to be marked as refugees. They do not want to be marked as victims of rape. They want to see themselves as survivors. Their own service providers clearly voice their own thoughts. The fact that they have come here for a better life. They have come here for a better life for themselves and for their children, and sometimes adult loved ones. And this life is what they want to make. It is much broader than simply dealing with trauma. It is about getting training. It's about moving on higher in society. It's about addressing matters of justice, matters of social justice in their lives. A lot of the immigrant groups are also beginning to point to the fact that they are looking at a much deeper form of integration in which their cultural knowledge matters. That the ability for them to settle down here depends a whole lot also on giving voice to what they see as the way forward. They want to have a take on matters such as parenting, matters such as gender relations within the family. They want to give their own take on issues of intimate partner violence. The women we have been working with in the African communities clearly voice the fact that the challenges they face will not be dealt with if that cultural knowledge is not placed in their if social policy, service provision are not placed in the context of women's cultural knowledge. We also are beginning to find out that what is happening within the families, what is happening with individuals, are also in many ways impacted by the broader immigrant community. That these individuals do not exist in a vacuum. In order to make meanings of their lives, they are going to embrace other kinds of relationships within their own what we call the new homelands, but the new communities. These communities need to be developed, and women have a very strong role. They have a huge role in making sure that these communities take hold. So while we are in the process of trying to welcome refugees, while we're in the process of trying to resettle them and take care of already arrived immigrants, we need to also know that they do not live in vacuums. They have to have communities. They have to build their own identities. They are not really new identities. They are identities embedded in a transnational context in which what is happening to them here is in many ways constantly configured by what is happening in their homelands, with families and cities, etc. It is becoming an increasingly revolving global community in every immigrant household. So while we'll welcome the new developments in Canada today with respect to refugees, we still want to have the matters that keep happening, that is really at the heart of providing a home for these people. We want to bring it to the forefront of service providers, many of whom we work with and many of whom voice these considerations with us, to policymakers to really pay attention to the considerations so that we can achieve a much deeper and a more holistic settlement or integration or whatever it is for the people who we are embracing as new Canadians. They need to find a home here. Their children need to find identity. There has to be a way forward for them to build a future in this place, and in building that future, their own input is very, very crucial. They must shape the contours of that development in order for it to work. So our own research has really moved us from that process of not simply focusing on individuals, has moved us in the process of looking at not simply basic needs, identity, but looking at also into matters of human security. It has moved us towards a process in which the cultural knowledge of women matter a whole lot. And I do hope that in receiving and helping to resettle new refugees, these considerations will also, attention will be paid to them.
Great.
Okay.
They can always cut it if it's important, they will include it and remove others.
So to summarize some of the key points that we would like to say in terms of recommendations for refugee psychosocial adaptation and social inclusion is recognizing the importance of resources and supports in not just from the first, most of the resources are placed in the first 6 months, providing supports for families as they settle. And what we know from research as well as wisdom and the experiences of the community members and service providers who work closely with refugee families is that some of the concerns start to emerge more in the second year, third year. And so what we are recommending is that while it's important that resources are placed at the front end, but that these will be sustained, and to allow families to really truly not only just resettle but integrate socially, so that they can be part of the fabric and contribute to the richness that we know many of the newcomer families do contribute in terms of providing for a socio-economic and cultural capital in this in our province.
Another recommendation that also come to the fore in our research is the need to bring these resources as closer as possible to these populations, because due to social cultural reservations, particularly for women, and sometimes pure lack of information, they may not know where to go, or sometimes maneuvering your way through the mainstream Canadian service system may be very overwhelming for many of them. It is actually, it will work better if we find working with service providers, culturally located agents who are in a position to bring the services closer to those who we are serving, so that they will be able to use these services and, as Dr. Yohani pointed out, make some of these services long-term, so that we can achieve a more long-lasting integration.